Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fifth installment of the Adult Task Force webinar series. My name is Amethyst Johnson Creek, and I am the Manager of Information and Referral Services here at the Tourette Association of America. For those of you that are tuning in for the first time, here at the TAA, we are committed to bettering the lives of individuals affected by Tourette Syndrome. We work to raise awareness to better the lives of individuals affected by Tourette Syndrome. We work to raise awareness, advance research, and provide ongoing support through our centers of excellence, chapters, support groups nationwide. Today, we'll be addressing the topic of navigating family and personal relationships. Social and family relationships can be difficult to navigate for anyone, even someone with Tourette syndrome. Although TS is not a social disability, people with Tourette syndrome are often more susceptible to problems with social acceptability. Today, we will discuss ways to combat this feeling. Here with us to expand upon this topic are Dr. Kompoliti and Eric McGowan. Dr. Kompoliti is Professor of Neurological Services, the Educational Director of the Movement Disorders Department of Neurological Sciences, and the Director of the Center of Excellence at Rush University Medical Center. She is the author and co-author of numerous publications. Her clinical interests as a principal investigator in research have focused on several therapeutic areas, including studies to evaluate safety and efficacy of new compounds to treat Tourette syndrome, Parkinson's disease, functional movement disorders, and dystonia. Eric McGowan is an acoustical consultant in the building industry. He graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Acoustics from Columbia College in Chicago and a Master of Arts in Architecture from the University of Kansas. He was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome at an early age, but did not knowingly meet another person with Tourette syndrome until he moved to Los Angeles, California as an adult. Eric first became involved with the Tourette Association's Southern California chapter in late 2016 and joined the board of directors in March 2018. He is also the director of Camp George, a sleepaway camp for youth and the Tourette syndrome, with youth with Tourette syndrome and their families. Okay, so we're going to start off with Dr. Kompoliti. Dr. Kompoliti?
Yes, I'm here. Okay, good afternoon. I'm Katie Kompoliti, and I'm a neurologist, a movement disorders neurologist at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. And today we're going to talk about the navigation of family and personal relationships in adults with Tourette's. These are the key points that Amethyst already read for you. And we're just going to go into the rest of my presentation. So I'm going to start with a quote from Aristotle, famous Greek philosopher before Christ, who said that man is by nature a social animal. An individual who is unsocial naturally and not accidentally is either beneath our notice or more than human. Society is something that precedes the individual. Anyone who either cannot lead the common life or is so self-sufficient as not to need to, and therefore does not partake of society, is either a beast or a god. So we need others, to live. No man is an island. So everybody can have their little thing, but we need to be part of a society to be able to thrive. And I'm going to spend the first part of my talk talking about social relationships in general, not in people with Tourette's, since it's probably the biggest part of how to be a social animal. And then I'm going to spend time on the peculiarities of navigating these relationships when you have Tourette's. So social functioning depends on social skills and the development and stability of peer relationships and friendships. As we cruise through life, we develop a toolbox of skills in social and emotional learning, and these include, but are not limited to, communication and relationship skills, self-regulation, self-awareness, decision-making skills, and social awareness. One of the biggest things that's important in being successful socially is what people call emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is the ability to manage one's own emotions and react to the emotions of others. And that depends on many things like self-awareness, self-management, motivation, empathy, and that special set of social skills that some people have more than others. Another big factor in creating social relationships is our ability to create personal boundaries. And this refers to the limits and rules we set for ourselves within relationships. And these boundaries depend on who we are, on our personality, but also they depend on differences coming from cultures and social settings. But let's talk about personalities first. There are different types of people, traits of personal boundaries, from the extreme of the rigid boundaries to the porous and leaky boundaries to healthy boundaries somewhere in the middle. So the people with rigid boundaries are the ones who avoid intimacy and close relationships, are unlikely to ask for help, have few close relationships, are very protective of personal information, may seem detached even with romantic partners, and keep others at a distance to avoid the possibility of rejection. So people with leaky boundaries or porous boundaries are the ones that overshare personal information. They have difficulty saying no to the requests of others, are over-involved with others' problems, depend on the opinions of others, and are accepting of abuse or disrespect, and fear rejection if they do not comply with what others dictate. And the healthy boundaries are somewhere in between, and that involves valuing one's opinions, but being ready to renegotiate when needed, people who don't compromise values for others, who share personal information in an appropriate way, they don't under or overshare, who know personal wants and needs and can communicate them, and are accepting to when they get rejected, when somebody says no to them. And all these are really hard to navigate, and sometimes we cross those boundaries, but in a sense, people usually fall in mostly on one or the other side. So social competence, in terms of neuroscience, reflects three areas of functioning: cognitive functioning, emotional functioning, and behavioral functioning. Cognitive functioning refers to understanding social rules, understanding others' perspective, and being able to express ideas to other people. The emotional boundaries refer to being able to manage emotions. That means being able to match the energy or the level of emotion to the social situation, to the appropriate social situation. Behavioral area of functioning, social functioning, refers to using social skills effectively, taking turns, making eye contact, sustaining a conversation, negotiating conflict. All these kind of traits of civilized social functioning. But, in terms of all of these abilities and talents, we are all in the same boat, whether, we have Tourette's or not. What makes people with Tourette's different? So people with Tourette's may have a perceived lack of social acceptability that makes things even harder in a situation that's already hard for most people. And they may have low self-esteem. Problems that people with Tourette's do not have, they do not have an inherent social disability. So what happens is when you have a lot of bullying and exclusion that can happen in a number of people with Tourette's early in life, that leads to loss of opportunities to develop social skills and flourish in friendships, and that puts you, so to speak, behind socially. It may lead to an impairment in social and emotional learning. But what it comes down to, as people age, when we become adults, and that's the same for all of us, Tourette or not, is to conquer self-doubt, to get on the right side of the spiral, and instead of going down the spiral of fear, stress, anxiety, insecurity, and conflict, go down the other side, the side of curiosity, self-awareness, learning, questioning things, and being yourself. So going back to the different areas of social competence, what are the problems we see in each one of those when it comes to Tourette's? In terms of the cognitive areas of functioning, in Tourette's, people with ADHD, impulse control, or OCD may have difficulties. When it comes to emotional competence of social functioning, anxiety and depression can interfere. And when it comes to behavioral competence of social function, ADHD may play a role. Actually, it may play a big role in the behavioral aspect of social functioning. So when we go back and look at the neurobiological basis of Tourette syndrome, what's happening in Tourette's is we cannot inhibit unwanted movements or vocalizations, and that manifests itself in tics. On the other end of the spectrum, our patients with Tourette's, a certain number of them may have difficulty inhibiting unwanted thoughts, which we call obsessions, or the actions in response of those thoughts, which we call compulsions. Or they may have difficulty in inhibiting behaviors, which we call impulses. And the right end of the spectrum refers either to OCD or ADHD, and the left end of the spectrum refers to the motor manifestations of Tourette syndrome. And this more or less involve the same network in the brain with some small differences. And this is a simplified scheme of the relationship between tic severity and associated psychopathology. And you see here on the left end of the spectrum, we have chronic tic disorder. That's what CTD stands for. And as you move to the right end, you have Tourette's, which is, as we know, motor and vocal tics. And on the far end of the spectrum, when you have the depression, the rage attacks, socially inappropriate behaviors, and NOSI stands for non-obscene socially inappropriate behaviors, ADHD, OCD, anxiety, and you start having the more severe tics. So it's that end of the spectrum where you have the more severe tics and the more severe psychopathology, what we call the comorbid disorders. And that's where most of the social learning and social functioning may be found to be impaired. So what's the relationship between tic severity, emotion regulation, and social outcomes in Tourette's? It seems that emotion regulation mediates the relationship between total tic severity and social functioning. That means the more stable an individual is emotionally can translate on how well they function socially, independent of tic severity. So the emotional dysfunction on the right end of the spectrum, most severe Tourette's with the comorbidities, is that subset of patients that have the non-obscene, socially inappropriate behaviors, the explosive outbursts, or the self-injurious behaviors. And in those cases, the emotional regulation can be seen as part of the wider issues of impulse control. And it turns out that the emotion recognition and response in social environments have to do with how well your executive function is working. So people with ADHD as a main comorbidity and a lot of executive dysfunction may have more impairment in emotion recognition and response in social situations. So here we're going to get a little technical for a little bit, so just stay with me. It appears that there are two main ways of dealing with emotion regulation, two main strategies. The one is the antecedent focus strategy of reappraisal, and that influences responses to emotion cues prior to these responses being activated. So you're thinking about, influences thinking about an emotional event in a way that changes its impact. And that affects both the experiential and the behavioral aspects of emotion regulation. So it affects both how you experience it and how you behave in response to that. The response-focused strategy of suppression it focuses on suppressing emotions to inhibit the expression of emotional behavior. And it's implemented once emotional responses are already underway. So they don't influence the way you experience emotions, but the behavioral aspect of emotion. It seems that the more frequent use of reappraisal, the top strategy, rather than the suppression, is maybe more adaptive in social settings. And it's associated with enhanced interpersonal functioning and psychological and physical well-being. On the other hand, the use of more suppression, response-focused strategy is associated with increased anxiety and depression. So the more, and we see the use of suppression strategies in the regulation of emotions, not only more in Tourette's, but in a wide variety of disorders like depression, panic disorders, PTSD, eating disorders. And it turns out that the use of suppression as a emotion regulation strategy may be more of a feature of psychopathology rather than specific to certain disorders. So in this specific study, when they looked into a group of patients with Tourette's and a group of patients matched for age and gender with no Tourette's, they found that there was more frequent use of suppression across a variety of negative emotions in Tourette's. So in the use of suppression was linked to higher depressive symptomatology. Those people who used more suppression in the expression of in an emotion regulation had higher depressive scores. And it turns out that maybe the emotion regulation that deals with suppression may share links with tic suppression may involve the same pathways in the brain. And the expertise in suppressing tic symptoms, which sometimes inherent in a lot of people with Tourette. A lot of people learn to do it subconsciously before they even can verbalize it, may relate to emotion regulation, especially in that subset of patients who have more depression, anxiety, and all these comorbid conditions on the right end of the spectrum. So that, what does that mean? That means that we can target the suppression of emotions by treatment if linked to distress when it comes to dealing with patients with Tourette's. So moving on to a different discussion, how do we create a healthier lifestyle socially? What are the aspects of a healthy lifestyle? And that this can be viewed as affecting the physical, psychological, and social parts of our lifestyle. So we, independent of Tourette's or not, people should learn how to practice what enhances social wellness. That means building a strong social support network, learning and practicing healthy communication techniques, developing the ability to relate with people in a variety of settings, dealing with interpersonal conflict in a healthy and respectful manner, exploring diversity by interacting with people of other cultures, backgrounds, and beliefs, valuing time alone and time with other people, and being aware of the social concerns in your community and getting involved in solving community problems. So when it comes to Tourette's, people with Tourette's, building social skills should involve a variety of techniques. The main one is mindfulness, practicing mindfulness, being able to practice deep breathing exercises and separate yourself from your emotions for the situations before entering stressful social situations. Practice an open and honest way of telling others you have Tourette's, and there's more than one ways of doing that, depending on who you are and what your personality is. Learning to be a good listener, that's true for everybody. And finally, incorporating all this to who you are. And being a neurologist who deals with people with chronic disorders is what it comes down to is not allowing a disease to define who you are. And that's especially more important when it comes to young people and dating, where you feel very vulnerable. That's when you have to remember that you are many more things than your Tourette syndrome alone, and that other people can see that. So I talked about mindfulness and breathing, and there are lots of techniques that people with Tourette's, and these techniques have been used, for everybody, for whether you have anxiety, depression, Tourette's, or you just want to get by in life easier. And these include progressive relaxation, when you learn how to tighten and relax various muscle groups. And that can be combined with guided imagery and breathing exercises. Guided imagery, where people are told to focus on pleasant images, and that can be self-directed or led by a practitioner or a recording. I think if you want to do that, you have to start with somebody teaching you before you are able to do on your own. Deep breathing, where you focus on slow, deep and even breaths, biofeedback, and that's a little bit more technical, where you measure, you have this little apparatus that measures body functions and gives feedback. So you, in a way, you learn how to control your body functions, and that's very important in some people with Tourette who sometimes feel vulnerable in not being able to control their own body. Practicing meditation and mindfulness and self-hypnosis. So what is mindfulness? With, called kind of all of these techniques can kind of converge at some point. So mindfulness or meditation is a mental state achieved by focusing on one's awareness on the present moment, while calmly acknowledging and accepting one's feelings, thoughts, and bodily sensations, but learning to live despite what's happening, the noise that's happening around you. And I'm going to spend a few minutes talking more about family relationships, and which is part of social relationships, but can be a lot more complicated in some ways and easier in others. It can be complicated because of a lot of baggage we all have carrying our families and all the skeletons in the closets. But it's a family. If you think about it, it's the one place where we all find unconditional love and acceptance. So they've done studies and looked at families of parents of children with Tourette's, and they found that they're more likely, of course, to experience more stress. And like with everything, this is a theme in everything we talk about Tourette's, that the comorbidities, if you have Tourette's alone, just tics, versus Tourette's with comorbidities, it makes a big difference. The presence of comorbidities always plays major role in aggravation, stress, and development of relationships, and in function. And some people argue that a lot of times, the health-related and quality of life-related impact of Tourette's is bigger from the comorbidities than the tics themselves, with few exceptions of the very severe tics. But despite all this, having a child with Tourette's did not affect parents' ratings of family routines, parent-child communication, and parental coping. But as hard as it is growing up and having Tourette's and dealing with the family, once you become an adult and you go out there in the big scary world as your own, you realize that home is a sanctuary. And when it comes to Tourette's, is the parents sometimes see the worst of the tics. And transition to adulthood sometimes associated with a loss of the parent-provided scaffolding, which can be important, especially for people with ADHD or executive problems. Can be problematic in terms of scheduling, emotional regulation, distress tolerance, financial responsibilities, and acceptance of adverse outcomes. So it's good to keep the family close for more than one reason. And it's good to work on improving family relations. And how do you do that? It's hard sometimes, but as I said before, this is a place of unconditional love, and you have to learn to communicate, show support for each other, encourage open discussions, and respect. So it all comes, when it comes to strategies and improving family relations, it all comes down to patience, understanding, and encouragement on both sides. And one important thing when dealing with all this is acknowledging the elephant in the room. And tics and Tourette's can be the elephant in the room, and it's better when we discuss and acknowledge the elephant than when we try to avoid it. So what are the take-home messages? Social and family relations are hard to navigate for everybody, even those who do not have Tourette syndrome. Tourette by itself is not an inherent social disability. People with Tourette's often have problems with social acceptability and low self-esteem, but they can learn to advocate for themselves, establish boundaries, and delineate priorities. And that's the end of my talk. And we're going to move on with Eric.
Hey everyone, my name is Eric McGowan. I'm from the Southern California chapter of the Tourette Association. Thank you, Dr. Kompoliti. That was great. Also, just remind everyone, if you have any questions for either of us, you can type them into the chat and we'll answer them after this. But okay, let's get going. If you could hit the next slide, please. All right, so just real quick, do a quick introduction. Actually, here, we'll just get to this in the interest of time. If you go to the next slide, perfect, we'll hop right in. So just a few thoughts before we really get into it. Just like Katie was saying, you know, social interactions, relationships, they're tough, just like us dealing with Tourette's. And these efforts to improve and build upon our social relationships and family relationships, they take effort, they take practice. You can't let the failures discourage you. I mean, me and along with probably many of you listening, it can be hard to, especially with having TS, to put ourselves out there and work on this. But, you know, practice makes perfect. And I just really want to quickly, you know, many of us, including myself, with TS, we deal with co-occurring conditions, OCD, ADHD, depression, anxiety, all of that. But the focus of this talk is mostly going to be around our tics and our TS. The next slide, please. So what are some challenges for everyone? Like Katie was saying, general insecurity, not just from our TS, but from a million other things in our life. The fear of judgment by others. You don't want to do anything that's looked at negatively by someone else. The desire to fit in with everyone, or at least not stand out from everyone. Different, but not in a way that might be uncomfortable. And then a lot of us, especially those of us with anxiety, we imagine the worst case scenario. You know, like, oh my God, if I putting myself in this situation, what all could go wrong? That's not just those of us with TS, that's everybody. Next slide. So what makes us different, those of us with TS? So our thing that we have, everybody has a thing or multiple things. It's usually out there on display for everyone. It's hard to ignore. It's hard not to see. I have motor and vocal tics, as do probably most people on this call, at least that are calling in with, you know, as adults with TS. Our tics still really aren't in the mainstream or widely understood by everyone. They might see what we're doing and they, you know, maybe they've never even heard of Tourette syndrome, or maybe they only think, you know, of the Hollywood Tourette syndrome, where it's, I like to call it, where it's just all we do is curse and have vocal outbursts. And we're very susceptible to awkward and offensive comments from others, especially those who don't understand what we're going through and where it's coming from. But a good thing that I think that makes us different is we have to have abnormally thick skin, meaning we've all dealt with throughout our childhood and into our adult years just a lot of challenges that come from all this that we're talking about, having TS, having the co-occurring condition. You know, we just build up this tolerance, and you know, we're generally tougher than a lot of people out there. Next slide. So a question that I would ask if we're all in person, who here has had a negative social interaction because of the TS? I imagine everybody's hand would be raised. But also, who has people in their lives, friends, loved ones, that they look at you, they don't just see your Tourette. They see you, whether you have a mild case or a more severe case. I bet most people here have multiple people in their lives who really don't look at you and just see your Tourette, no matter if you're having a good day, a bad day, mild day, severe day. Next slide. So Katie touched on this a bit. Is Tourette's a social disability? And everything I have on this slide, if you're looking at the bottom, there's this amazing woman named Jaleesa in Northern California. She has a YouTube channel. She's a young adult with TS. She did a video on this a while back as part of the video she puts out, and I thought it was awesome. So we'll go back to the top. So tics aren't the problem in a social situation. It's all about the environment that we're in. So as general examples, I think Jaleesa says, it's like, say you have a job interview somewhere, you're qualified for the job, you make a great candidate, but you're in a wheelchair, and it's like the interview is taking place on the second floor. Well, you're fine. You just have to get up to the second floor. The environment needs to accommodate that, and they do. And there's a way to get you up there. Great. That is an environment that can allow us to thrive. It's not you being in a wheelchair that's the problem with you getting this job. It's just that you need an environment that can help you get to where you need to go. And a specific example, like we were talking about before, real friends, they don't care about your Tourette. They care about you being a good friend to them, a good person. If someone can't be friends with you or have a relationship with you because of your Tourette's, they probably wouldn't be interested in having a relationship with you if you didn't have Tourette's. They're looking, they're finding that's on them. That's the environment. That they are not allowing themselves to be someone that can support someone that they don't understand or is different. And that's going to go way beyond just someone they meet with Tourette's. Tics can be a catalyst for a poor social interaction. You do something, somebody doesn't understand what's going on, but that responsibility isn't on you. That's on others. It's kind of a similar thing here. If someone's being rude to you in public because of your tics, it's probably not just tics that are going to bring that behavior out of them with you or in the future. Like they're looking for a reason to be mad or to be hurtful or all of that. And I know either a lot of us either have experienced ourselves or know others who have more severe tics, or at least periods of having severe tics, punching, fighting. We've all seen it. It is tougher. But that being said, a lot of us have spent time with, or if we haven't, we've spent time around other people, or even with this, it's really not an issue. And it doesn't have to be an issue, at least not a big issue that keeps you from being where you need to be in terms of a social relationship, a family relationship, all of that. And once again, thanks to Jaleesa for the prompt, basically, for this great topic. Next slide, please. Okay, huge recap. So, no, TS is not an inherent social disability. Just like with all sorts of disabilities or conditions outside of TS, it's about the environment. It's not you have this and therefore that's it for you. Next slide, please. So how do we address our tics? I like to look at it in terms of offense or defense, being a sports fan myself. So offense, you bring it up early so everyone's on the same page from the beginning. You're in a room, going around the class, first day of class, tell us a little about yourself. Boom, you bring it up then, and now everyone's on the same page. Personally, I'm somebody that likes to deal with various things through humor. I've made a joke about my TS a million times as a little icebreaker or just around friends. Not saying that that's something that everyone should do or would be comfortable doing, but that's just another example of like the offensive approach in terms of discussing and bringing up your Tourette's. But also, wait to address your TS until it comes up. Sometimes it may never come up. Maybe they already understand what TS is. Maybe they just look past it and it's just not an issue to them. But, waiting to talk about that until it's brought to you. But really, you want to do what's best for you based on your relationship and experience with your own tics. Don't be afraid to put yourself out there. If you've never tried an offensive approach before where you get out ahead of it, in my experience, most people just that are asking questions or looking at you funny or whatever the case may be, they just don't understand what Tourette's is. And most of the time, if they ask or if you explain it, that's kind of the end of it. There may be some questions that pop up, but it's like, oh, okay, well, now I understand. Personally, for me, I use a combination of both offensive and defense, just kind of depending on the scenario I'm in. But you want to do what works best for you. Next slide. You also want to advocate for yourself and for others. If somebody comments on TS, briefly educate them. I don't think there's always a need to go into a lot of detail unless they're curious, unless you're comfortable doing so. But most of the time in my experience, if there's a question, give a little short answer, a little background, and usually that's enough. You also want to surround yourself with people that will advocate for you and that will support you. Even outside of TS, you don't want that bad energy around you. So just like it might, if it's some totally unrelated condition, you don't want people that aren't going to stick up for you. Same thing with Tourette's. Surround yourself with a good support network. And also, do what you want to do, but I firmly believe there's no reason you should ever need to apologize for having Tourette's, just because someone doesn't understand. Like, oh, why do you make that sound? Oh, I can't help it. I have Tourette's. It's like, well, that's annoying. Stop. It's like, it's not on you to say sorry. It kind of goes back to that, it's about the environment. You're doing what you can and you have to live with this. And there really doesn't need to be a whole lot of really going far out of your way to address and make someone else feel better about your Tourette's. We all know it's a lot worse for us than it is for them. Next slide, please. This is my favorite. I think all of us have gone through plenty of this. The unsolicited advice. I've been asked things like this all the time, like, oh, maybe a gluten-free diet would help you, or try these supplements, or try this crazy thing that I just came up with in my brain because it helps me with something. It goes on and on. Next slide, please. So how do we address unsolicited advice? It's no doubt annoying. It's always annoying. It's always been annoying. It'll always be annoying, at least to me. But I like to consider the nature of the advice. Where is it coming from? Are they trying to be helpful? Great. So that's like step one. But if, you say, hey, I don't really, I don't need advice. I know what I'm doing. Sorry. So are they listening to your response? How are they, are they respecting your response? If you say, no, that won't help, and actually, none of this will help. If they take that response and they respect it and they leave it alone, I really like to let it go and actually spin it into a positive in my life. They're trying to help. They realize that maybe they can't help, and then they respect that. So it can get old, but I think most of the time in my experience, people are coming from more of a caring place and simple ignorance. And if they're being respectful, I usually try to just let that go. An example I like to give, it's like if you're a writer for a TV show, something like that, fans or people that have heard of you and then come up to you and be like, oh, you should do this in the future thing, and you should do this, and I have a great idea for this. Most of those suggestions are going to be just awful, terrible, not help this production at all. But it's probably coming from a place of like, I want to help. Next slide. So boundaries, we kind of touched on this when it comes to addressing your tics, but you want to have boundaries and determine your relationship with your own tics. Especially when it comes to what I'm doing socially. I want to do what everyone's doing, what my friends are doing, going out, all of that. But you need to look out for yourself. Just staying out late, getting little sleep, does that make your tics worse? What about being in a large crowd, like at a concert? What if you're of age and drinking makes your tics worse? Sugar makes your tics worse. Sometimes you might be like, you know what, it's going to make it a little bit worse, but, I want to go have fun. But it's also like, maybe I got a big test tomorrow or something and I'm not feeling well. Like, look out for yourself. Set some boundaries for yourself when it comes to your Tourette's, and try to avoid putting yourself unnecessarily into situations where it's going to exasperate. So monitor yourself. And if plans are up in the air with some friends, with family, maybe suggest something that will help you. It'll put you in a better place for that night or that day. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh. All right. Actually, was there one slide before this? Sorry.
Yeah. You have to do the conclusions.
There we go. So, in conclusion, to recap this whole thing, most people, not just those with TS, dealing with insecurities that affect their social life in some capacity. TS is not an inherent social disability. If interactions are going poorly because of your tics, probably not on you. Others should be able to look past your tics and to help you be in an environment that's going to help you thrive. Have a conversation with yourself about your tics. How do you want them addressed? How do you want to address? What are you comfortable with? What's going to help you there? Advocate for yourself, advocate for others with TS, and expect your friends and your family to do the same, at least to some extent. Try to forgive those who are wrong or uneducated about Tourette's, especially with unsolicited advice, but try to be, if they're respectful and willing to listen, that's someone that can very easily become an ally. Establish boundaries for yourself. Know what you shouldn't do to help your tics based on how you're feeling, based on what you need to do later, etc. And if someone can't look past your tics, they probably aren't worth your time. Good people, which is most people, will see you for you. They'll look past your Tourette, look past all of that. And with all of that, we can all go ahead and, live a life where we have good, strong social and family relationships. And now that's it. And if anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to answer.
Okay, the first question comes from Sandra C. And it reads, for adults who see an increase in tics around stressful relationship situations, it can be discouraging, often leading them to feel they do better alone, with their evidence being reduction of tics when alone and a reduction in OCD and ADHD. How would you respond to these clients, especially around the need for connection seen in your earlier slides, but the stress that connection creates an increase of tics and other symptoms?
Do you want to go first, Eric, or you want me to?
I can go really quickly, just speaking from my own experience. I've gone through periods where that's absolutely true. And it even is truer now, like, when I'm alone with my tics, oftentimes they are a little better, or maybe actually for me, they're usually a little worse when I'm by myself, but the pressure on me to, suppress or try to fit in, it's much easier for me to ignore my tics, even if they are a little bit worse when I'm alone. But I really do think that even though it's hard, especially at first, trying to go out and build some relationships and your tics are worse, it just, I personally, I think it's still important to get out there and to put your best foot forward. And, as long as you're comfortable, to try to progress in those relationships. And there's also ways to, for me, the more comfortable I get around somebody, the less I care, even if they're kind of bad. Talking over the phone, online friends, things like that. It's all There's no real wrong way to do it, but I mean, I guess I'll end this with saying, like, it can be very difficult, and it's certainly been very difficult for me personally as an adult with TS in the past, and it still is today. It's hard, but for me, I try to go out there and I try to keep consistently putting myself in some sort of social situation, if nothing else, just to normalize it a little bit more. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. I totally agree. And even though, I don't have tics and Tourette's, and I think we cannot live alone. I mean, you cannot just lock yourself in a basement and work from your computer. You can do it, but there's so much, you're missing so much from what life really is. We have to be with others, either personally or professionally in many aspects. So you have to figure out how to make it work, like with everything in life. So is it the anxiety that prevents you? Is it the anxiety that's driving the tics? Could be that. I mean, I think, we shouldn't be shy into addressing what the problem is. And I know, Eric put it in a nicer way. Unfortunately, I'm just a doctor here. But, if what it takes is to learn how to deal with that enhanced anxiety from being around people, just let's deal with it, either with behavioral techniques, learning how to breathe, or life is all about learning how to breathe, or even medication if you need that. But we cannot just be alone. This shouldn't be the reason to put you back in the couch alone.
Okay. Next question comes from Michael D. With respect to workplace relations, what type of reasonable accommodations do TS community members ask for? What are some quote unquote offensive ways of dealing with supervisors who are not with Tourette behaviors?
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the most common I've heard of have been, having your own workspace. And that's perhaps the most important, especially for people who deal with vocal tics, and having to suppress all day, maybe, taken away from the concentration you need to do your job. Or, that would be the biggest one. Or, if you need accommodations in terms of executive function, etc. But I think if you're doing, if you're honest and you're doing a good job, people usually are willing to help. I mean, the most extreme situations I've seen in terms of lack of willingness to accommodate has been, very few, and they have to do either sometimes with the corporate phenomena or with the fact that they, that may not be an excuse. They may not want to accommodate you even if you didn't have Tourette's. But in the most part, I think if you're contributing and you're doing your job and you have reasonable and concrete proposals, people just respond. Eric? Are we still on?
Yes, we are.
Hey, sorry, I had myself muted. I agree very much. That's almost exactly what I was going to say. If usually the separate workspace is what I've heard. I personally kind of took an offensive approach with it, and I brought it up and kind of addressed the company that I worked for early. And yeah, if you're able to do your job, the willingness for employers and coworkers to go out of their way to help you is more than probably you would expect. Personally, I've had good experiences. Obviously, there's going to be some bad experiences that people have had, but if you're able to do your to do your work and you're able to do it well, almost all the time, people are going to go out of their way to help you succeed.
Okay. This next question comes from Mary D. What is the easiest way to explain Tourette's to someone?
Oh, Eric, you have to take that.
I maybe tried 5 million ways in my life. Usually I just kind of keep it short and simple. Just, you know, it's an involuntary movement or sound. I can't control it. I can feel it coming, but I can't stop it. And I usually try to give an example. It's like the one I like to use is, like a lot of people say, like, I have an itch.
Yeah.
An itch on my arm, and when I scratch it, it feels better as I'm scratching. And then that itch just slowly builds up until I have to scratch again. That's what it feels like for me, for all of my tics, anything from my face to my hands, to my head, to my vocal tics, everything. It all feels some version of that. And that's kind of where I've ended up after 20 years of trying to describe it to people.
Okay. And let's see. The next one comes from Colleen C. Are there any suggestions for someone learning to embrace their tics?
That's an interesting question. For me, what has worked for me is the knowledge that anything I'm trying to do, if I'm trying to do the same thing that someone else is doing with neurotypical, not with TS, I am working even harder behind the scenes, something people can't see. You know, it's like, oh, just this task on its own, that's easy. Like this task with Tourette, that's some really hard work. I can't think of everything to answer your question right now, but for me, I kind of embrace that, the fact that I know I'm really going above and beyond to be able to, you know, if I succeed at something, I earned that. And the second thing for me is it took a while for me to get here, especially didn't feel this way through high school, most of college, but I embraced how it made me a little bit different. I'm someone that is drawn to weirdness and creativity and things like that. And there's certainly no shortage of that in our community, those of us with TS. But embracing the creative side that I think it's brought to my life and the uniqueness, just personally, that's how I've learned, and that's where I've ended up when it comes to embracing my tics.
I think really nice what you said, because that's what you do too, right? That helped you be who you are professionally, right, Eric? That creative side of yours.
Mm-hmm. I think it's, in hindsight, it's helped me in a lot of ways throughout my life. I mean, would I flip the magic switch and stop ticking? Probably. But if that's not going to happen, there are a lot of ways. It takes work. It can be very tough at times, but I think it has really helped shape my life for the better once I started to look at how it can make me unique and different, and experiences maybe I've had, or it's really a huge, big, sort of robust thing. But yeah, I try to look at it as almost a superpower, as if you've probably heard a lot of people say it's not your traditional superpower, but it's helped me a lot with other things in my life that have nothing to do with Tourette.
Great.
Okay. And this one has to do back with when we're referring back to offensive strategies. This one comes from Nancy G. How do you suggest handling your TS in a job interview? Offense or defense? If offense, when in the process?
I have gone in my adult life. I don't think I ever brought it up for little like jobs I had in high school when I was a lot younger, but I bring it up because for me, there's no hiding it. You're going to see my face scrunching and moving all over, and me kind of jumping up on my feet and shaking my head. And there's just, if you talk to me for more than 10, 15 seconds, you will know something's going on. So I tend to bring it up. I don't necessarily bring it up right off the bat. But I like to and be like, hey, just as you may have noticed, or as you may notice, I have Tourette syndrome. And then, it's a short little explanation like we just talked about of, what that is. And then I try to tell the same thing that I just said in the last couple of questions or answers I've given about how I think it's helped me and made me stronger and work harder. And to my knowledge, I have never had bringing up my Tourette ultimately be a detriment in an interview process. I like to, the offensive approach, get it out of the way so we can go straight into concentrating on why I think I'm the best person for this job.
Very good.
Okay, well, that's all the time that we have. Again, thank you, Dr. Kompoliti and also Eric, for joining us today. And if your questions weren't answered during our Q&A session, I will get back to you and I'll email you the presenter's answers. Or if you haven't had a chance to submit your question, you can send it to support@tourette.org. So everyone have a good evening, or good afternoon rather, and stay safe.
Thank you, everyone.